Hello and welcome everyone to the global webinar on the changing climate for private equity. I'm Dazzle Bhujwala, Director Investor Network at Ceres. Today's webinar is jointly hosted by Ceres and the Sustainability Institute by ERM. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with Ceres and ERM, but since we have a large global audience today, I will quickly make an elevator pitch for both Ceres and ERM. Ceres is a leading sustainability advocacy organization transforming the economy to build a just and sustainable future. We work with the world's largest and the most influential investors, companies, and policymakers to solve the world's greatest sustainability challenges. ERM is a global sustainability consultancy firm. It partners with the world's leading organizations, creating innovative solutions to sustainability challenges and unlocking commercial opportunities. The Sustainability Institute is ERM's primary platform for thought leadership. Building on the strengths of the two organizations and in our efforts to accelerate the pace of climate action, we jointly released a report earlier this month, The Changing Climate for Private Equity. The aim of this report is to accelerate investor action on the climate crisis by unlocking the potential of private equity to help attain the goals of the Paris Agreement. In the next 57 odd minutes, our panelists here will help us unlock the key insights of this report and discuss how leading asset owners and private equity managers are integrating climate into their investment decisions. We will also take a few questions towards the end. So I encourage everyone to put your questions and send in your questions via the Q&A function, which is on the bottom right corner of your Zoom platform. Try and avoid sending the questions in the chat function. We will only take questions which come in the Q&A section. Before I introduce the panel, let me also share a brief background about the report and set the stage for our discussion. Climate crisis demands urgent action. Institutional investors now recognize climate as a systemic risk, and many of them are taking bold actions and have set net zero commitments. The big question now is how quickly can they turn these commitments into action? For credible action, they will have to focus on all asset classes within their portfolios. One asset class that has seen consistent growth in portfolio construction over the past decade and is likely to grow further is private equity. Just to put this in number perspective, today, globally, we have nearly $5 trillion invested in private equity, and this number has tripled in the last decade and is likely to further double in the next 5 years. However, when it comes to integrating disciplined and transparent climate action, private equity has a long road ahead compared to other asset classes. Having said that, private equity is uniquely positioned to transition and accelerate the pace of decarbonization. So, unless we bring private equity into mainstream climate discussions, investors and in turn the planet risk not meeting the net zero ambition. Seeing this particular challenge, Ceres and ERM partnered earlier this year to create climate awareness and support the private equity sector for harnessing the potential it has in tackling the climate crisis. As part of our report process, we interviewed some of the largest and the most influential general partners and limited partners across North America and Europe to understand 4 broad areas. And these limited partners and general partners, there were 27 interviews that we conducted with a collective AUM of $3.2 trillion, typically the ones who represent the private equity sector. The 4 broad areas that we covered as part of our report process were trying to mainly understand the current climate landscape for private equity, the challenges that the industry is facing, how investors are trying to overcome these challenges, and what more can be done for the industry. The insights that we received during these interviews are presented in our report, and these have also helped us shape specific recommendations for both the GPs and the LPs, which would help them develop and implement credible climate action plans and ultimately be a part of the net zero economy. So without further delay, let me introduce our distinguished panel and jump right into the discussion. We have Jaideep Das, partner and global lead for M&A advisory and finance sector lead for EMEA at ERM. Elizabeth Seeger, managing director, sustainable investing at KKR. Mátyás Csiky, responsible for ESG and sustainability at Partners Group. And Michael Eisenberg, head of ESG integration at New York State Common Retirement Fund. With this, let's get started. Jaideep, let's start with you. And it would be great if you can highlight the key insights and recommendations from the report.
Sure. Thank you, Dazzle. And hello, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be part of this panel and having collaborated with Ceres on this really important project. Also wanted to take a moment to just thank all the private equity firms and the asset owners who shared their very valuable insights during the development of this report. And I think, as you alluded to, Dazzle, there's clear evidence that whilst we do have leadership within private equity on this very important topic of climate change, and that's both at a fund level as well as the way in which they are engaging with their portfolio companies. But there's clearly a lot more opportunity for the sector as a whole to really increase both the scale and the pace of action on climate. And there are some key drivers that is really encouraging increased action. And that's not just from a compliance point of view. Be the regulatory drivers that we're seeing in particular in Europe through the SFDR or the EU taxonomy kind of regulations, or the increased momentum in the US following the sort of Biden administration. But also the LP kind of engagement and compliance with the request. But more importantly, I think what we've seen is a growing awareness, both in terms of the risks, understanding that it's a systemic risk impacting the economy as a whole, as well as, I think importantly, there's great opportunities to make investments in this space. And I think not to also forget that there's a wider stakeholder expectations element here. And that wider stakeholder expectations for private equity could mean very well how do they engage their current and future talent in their own funds, and the way they make their future decisions in terms of appealing to the new generation of companies, and also supporting those companies, those portfolio companies, to engage with their sensitive and climate conscious kind of customer base. But there's clearly a lot of, whilst there's drivers, there's obviously some challenges that is impeding progress. And if we really look at some of these challenges, I think the number one that we keep hearing from the private equity community is really a lack of consistent and comprehensive, I would say, data on greenhouse gas emissions, particularly at the underlying kind of portfolio level. That's kind of impeding progress. And it's not helped by the fact that there's a lack of, if you like, universally accepted or mandated frameworks, albeit things like TCFD is increasingly being adopted. The SASB materiality matrices are very helpful, but there's still a lack of sort of a uniform approach here. And also, as we know, in the regulatory markets, it's not sending a uniform or a level playing field in terms of the policies it's sort of rolling out across the globe. And whilst there is definitely an increased traction in private equity, and there's a lot of very visible senior leaders, but as a whole, again, I think at senior management level, in particularly some of the mid-market space or some of the more conventional areas, I think there needs to be a greater traction and understanding and commitment from senior leaders to really embrace this topic and act on it. And finally, coming to sort of, net zero as a concept. I mean, it's a fairly new concept, I would say, for the whole economy and private equity, and so for private equity. And I think without strong clarity on what it really means for private equity, how do you take tangible actions? And, there's a risk that it will become a hollow promise or a slogan. And then there are some challenges around net zero, particularly in a private equity context, because there's a constant flux of portfolio companies. It's very difficult for them to predict what's their portfolio going to look like in 2035, 2040, or let alone 2050. But having said that, there are some good practices that we've seen, and I'll touch on those in a second. And in terms of those emerging good practices, I think it's fair to say, a lot of it is based on the TCFD again framework, which lays out, particularly a strong focus on governance. And we see some great examples of private equity firms, both sort of large buyouts, mid-market funds, really starting to engage at a fund level, the board of the fund, but also the boards of the companies, because that's where they have most influence, and the power of active ownership, it really comes into being. They're also putting that the board level commitment into strategy development for the entire firm, and that strategy is informed by firms really undertaking, I would say, portfolio-wide understanding or looking at both the climate risks and opportunities, and where the hotspots might be and how they might be able to address that in a very systematic way. At a more tactical level or operational level, there's increasing focus on understanding these issues at a pre-investment due diligence kind of stage. And that could be, again, if you're looking at a more benign business from a climate perspective, it could be a very high level kind of light touch approach. Whereas if you're looking at an infrastructure or an energy kind of mandate, you'll go much deeper dive, both on the transition risk and opportunities, as well as on the physical side. In the portfolio ownership, obviously, we increasingly see a lot of firms do baseline analysis of footprint, but I think what we're seeing the leaders really do is, what do you do with that data? They're really helping their underlying companies to improve their GHG performance by decarbonizing, but not just in their operations, but also looking at innovative products and solutions that can help them get a competitive edge. And some are increasingly sort of investing behind climate solutions as a PE firm, and I'll touch on that later as well. And finally, it all starts with, understanding where the firms and their companies are. It's disclosure, and then that disclosure around where they are, setting meaningful targets to move towards the Paris-aligned goals. So again, science-based targets is something we see some of the private equity firms embrace and their portfolio companies. And also some, while it is difficult, as we've discussed, net zero goals are not easy. We're starting to have that conversation. What would that scenario look like? What is in their sector, what a roadmap might look like, and supporting those companies to take those measures. Now, coming from emerging best practice to really recommendations, I think, our report was pretty clear. There are 5 key things. There's a number of things they could be doing, but I think really fully, capitalize on this opportunity as well as systematically address the risk. We see 5 key priority steps. First of all, as we just discussed earlier, I think really embedding climate risk and opportunity systematically into the firm's governance, into their policies and investment practices. I think that's really important because, the strategy is only as good as the implementation. Second, enhancing the level of disclosure. Yes, it's going to be a journey for most companies and most firms, but it's important to get started now. And as we talked about, starting to think about how they could reduce their emissions profile and be part of this new low carbon economy. Finally, the last 2 points are around really capitalizing on the investment opportunities. There's plenty of opportunities to invest behind the low carbon opportunities, not just in the renewable space, but the whole sort of hydrogen value chain, the automobile value chain, across various sectors. There's a great opportunity to do so. And as we will hear later on today, and we've heard in previous discussions, there are great practices out there. Let's get some better alignment on those practices, what good looks like, set certain standards, and get the industry moving in one direction.
Great. Thanks, Jaideep. Let's start with the net zero question. And Jaideep, you mentioned setting net zero targets is not easy. It needs a thorough due diligence processes. Michael, I would like to bring you into the conversation now, considering New York State Common has already set an ambitious goal. And it's one of the only pension funds who has set reducing net zero, emissions to net zero by 2040, much earlier than the usual we see at 2050. How easy or challenging it has been for integrating climate risk assessment specifically into private equity investments and allocate capital to low carbon investments?
So thanks, Dazzle, and nice to be here with everyone today. I want to thank Ceres and ERM for the opportunity to join the discussion. So to your question, Dazzle, none of those things are ever easy. Putting in place the governance structure around integrating climate into our investment process, building the risk and opportunity frameworks, tailoring investment committee deliverables by strategy and manager, embedding the climate factors into the ESG due diligence sessions we conduct on every investment, being able to package up the results of that process for our organization in a decision useful manner, communicating our approach to our GPs and providing feedback, staying on top of global best practices and building those into the ongoing manager monitoring conversations we have. None of that is easy. There are challenges associated with putting those things into place, clearly, but that said, we thought it was critical to do all of those things and be systematic at scale across all of our investments and be thoughtful about how we're incorporating it into the fund's overall investment process. And by the way, that's exactly what we look to see from our GPs too. We need to be eating our own cooking, as it were, in this area. And so the net zero by 2040 goal is an accelerant to what we're doing, but the execution and the underlying processes and work on each and every transaction is what makes that commitment real. So working with all investment team members during diligence, as well as monitoring GPs on their ESG integration and climate programs, asking the questions, sharing best practices from across our global GP base, talking about portfolio construction and subsectors, all of that brings our commitment to life. On the low carbon investment piece of your question, Dazzle, that's another area the fund already had made a $20 billion commitment over a 10-year period to our sustainable investments and climate solutions program. And we're already more than halfway toward meeting that goal. We invest behind 9 sustainability themes within that portfolio, and climate and environment is the first theme on our list. Any prospective investment for that program needs to predominantly focus on at least one of those 9 themes to be eligible. And the fund hired a dedicated senior leader to head up that program to work with investment teams to jointly underwrite investments, source additional investments for the fund, evaluate impact measurement, and ensure that it's consistent with our criteria and meets our risk return and scale requirements, which is of course a challenge. So having all those pieces in place that I just described, the expertise internally, the process and governance structure, we believe that provided a certain level of comfort to our organization around making that net zero by 2040 commitment.
Yeah, the discipline is important. And Mátyás, it clearly seems that the pressure from the LPs is increasing. However, the industry is still facing challenges such as the inconsistent data, lack of single disclosure on net zero standards. How is Partners Group coping up with the evolving practices, the challenges that the industry is facing, and atop it all, the evolving regulatory framework that we are seeing, especially emerging in Europe, and US is not letting themselves behind. So it would be interesting to understand what is Partners Group doing to overcome these challenges.
No, thank you very much, Dazzle, and thank you very much for having me on this webinar. It's a pleasure to be here. That's a great question. Now, I fully agree, inconsistent data, lack of standards, that is definitely a big issue. Before I go into, let's say, the biggest issue around it is, maybe let's look at how we do it on the direct side, or especially on our direct lead portfolio. So for the last few years, we have built up a robust ESG KPI tracking framework, which also includes tracking scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. And it's really quite a process. It takes quite some time to get that information. There's a lot of validation required to make sure that the information is consistent. And we've published our ESG KPI dashboard, which includes greenhouse gas intensity for the 3rd time in a row now. Now, at this point, this includes scope 1 and scope 2 for our direct lead portfolio, and we're working on scope 3 emissions. As everyone here on the call is aware, scope 3 emissions is, of course, the more challenging scope that you need to figure out. And what we've started doing there is engage with our largest industrial companies in different sectors, and really try to understanding what are the scope 3 emissions here, and then from that you can also better understand scope 3 emissions in similar companies. Now, what I would say just in general around data tracking, and I think that's where we very much welcomed also the European Union's SFDR regulation, is that for indirect investments, fund-of-fund investments, or minority shareholdings, of course, you do have a different governance structure. So we don't have the benefit of controlling the board and can go to the board or to management and say, hey guys, we need scope 1, we need scope 2 emissions. So in that sense, the regulation was really great, because now, at least in the European Union, managers over time are forced to report on that. This helps us to better understand the overall footprint that we have in the portfolio. Also on the debt side, I mean, there we're even more detached from the control side of the investment. And I think in that sense, the regulation has really been a great push in the EU. And we hope that, of course, the Biden administration sort of is along the same lines here and is closely aligned with European regulation, would make everyone's life easier. Just on your point on standardization, if not everyone would start developing their own frameworks. I think maybe TCFD is probably one of the best frameworks out there that has been taken on by so many companies, which to me is really a great testament to or testimony to how well thought through this framework really is.
Good. Elizabeth, let's talk about KKR being one of the largest private equity managers in the world. How is KKR coping up with these challenges? And I believe the SFDR regulation in Europe is not only just limited to the European GPs. KKR being a global firm does impact y'all as well. So it would be great to hear how is KKR evolving or coping up with evolving practices.
Yeah, Dazzle, thank you. And yes, absolutely, we are affected by the SFDR and various trends from around the world. But before I get into how we're addressing that, I want to just say how thrilled I am to be part of this conversation and also to see Ceres and ERM collaborating on this important topic. As you know, we've been members of the Ceres Investor Network on climate risk for since 2013, and we've been working with ERM strategically since at least 2014. And full disclosure, ERM is now a KKR portfolio company as of not too long ago. So if you hear me mention it in the comments, just want to make sure everybody understood that as well. So, the data issue is a really important one and one we've been struggling with in the decade plus that I've been at KKR. And I would say that, one of the points in the report that I sort of disagree with is that I think we have enough frameworks. I think we have enough standards. We figured out how to measure carbon emissions. What we are missing, though, is methodologies and maybe technologies that yield actionable, decision-useful information. And so where are GPs right now? We're in a situation where on the one hand, we have LPs that are requesting or requiring scope 1 and 2 and hopefully scope 3 emissions. And then on the other hand, we have a number of portfolio companies. If you have a global portfolio, diverse portfolio, a number of portfolio companies who don't even know their greenhouse gas emissions, let alone report them to us or to other stakeholders. And so there's going to be, not surprisingly, a trade-off between cost and effort and the adequacy and clarity of the data that you get. And so that is, directionally correct data is good enough for maybe developing an engagement strategy. It is not good enough for setting targets and setting accountability. So we don't have enough time to talk about all the things that we've tried over the decade plus at KKR, but I'll highlight two things about where we're going or where we are right now and where we're going. And the first is we're setting expectations on this point. So we just recently committed 3 of our flagship funds, 2 of them private equity, to making sure that all of our controlled investments in those portfolios, in those funds, are measuring and reporting their own greenhouse gas emissions. We think that really building the muscle and capabilities within the companies is critical, not just for GPs and LPs, but for the future of these companies to make sure they're on the trajectory for managing these issues over the time. And in those same funds, we've committed that those controlled investments will be putting in place decarbonization plans that are aligned with a net zero commitment by 2050. You can't do that without an adequate greenhouse gas footprint. So that's number one. The second place I'll highlight is that we're increasing our toolkit. So one of the really great aspects of private equity is we're working across a portfolio of companies. Our objectives are aligned with theirs in terms of creating value. We can act as a resource to these companies and guide them along the way. So we're doing that in a couple of ways that I'll mention. One is we have in-house expertise. This isn't necessarily going to be the case for all GPs, but at KKR, we've been able to hire somebody starting in 2014 who is working with portfolio companies on resource management issues. We're hiring a new person starting next month who is a climate and energy associate who will be working with KKR portfolio companies. And then we're also identifying preferred vendors that we can recommend to our portfolio companies like ERM or others who can help them in the process of evaluating, managing, and reporting their own data. So while good enough data is okay to get started on this, I think what's really important for us as GPs and managers of these companies is to help them get started on this trajectory of collecting and managing their own data in a way that will be actionable for us, them, and our LPs in the future.
I think it's a good breadth to see, Elizabeth, you mentioned the data is already out there. It's a question of, how do you really package the data and which really fits into developing robust strategies and methodologies. Taking that point, Mátyás, I should bring you over here again, considering that Partners Group has still not committed to net zero, but you all have a robust climate strategy. And it would be great to understand what approach, what is the governance approach that Partners Group did take. And I'm trying to now allude towards the best practices or the evolving practices, since Elizabeth did mention started with that. So let's get into the evolving practices that we are seeing and specifically talk about the governance approach that Partners Group has adopted.
No, absolutely. Thanks a lot, Dazzle. I think I should start here by saying that in 2020, we've publicly supported the TCFD. As mentioned before, I think that's probably really one of the best frameworks out there. And I'm happy that everyone's committing to this one framework. It makes a lot of sense. And because it makes so much sense, we've applied the recommendations of the TCFD also to our climate change strategy, which we published earlier this year. Now, the first element of the climate change strategy and one of the recommendations of the TCFD is to figure out how your governance structure should be around climate-related risks, identifying the opportunities, and really making sure there's accountability within the organization from board level to executive level and then down into the investment and operational teams, because otherwise you will not be able to track and manage the risk accordingly. I think one thing that I would really recommend everyone to do when they go about this is get senior level backing early on and work with senior management on this. Otherwise, it's just really a difficult journey. I think we're in the lucky position that Andre Frey, our co-CEO, who's been heading the company for almost 8 years now, or actually for more than 8 years now, is going to become, as of July 1st, the sustainability chairman of Partners Group. And with that, of course, he was also the sponsor of our climate change strategy and really helped us when, for example, you wanted to go to different teams. If you have an individual that has been with the organization for a long time and knows who to ask for which sort of information, that is worth $1 million, to be fair. I think the other element that I would then say is once you have defined your governance structure and once you've gone down the road as recommended by the TCFD, you need to also get alignment across mid-level management. People need to stand behind the strategy. Otherwise, the document, even if you publish it, I mean, we all know if you don't, you can publish a policy, but if you don't live it, then it's quite challenging to enforce it. And just on your comment before on net zero emissions, yes, you're absolutely right. We haven't publicly announced a net zero commitment as of yet. We did so on corporate level. on portfolio level, we have committed to align our portfolio with the Paris Agreement. And there's a good reason in our view why we have not committed to a net zero target as of yet. And that's, we said we want to first go and work with our portfolio companies, and we have developed a climate change sweep, which is basically a deep engagement with companies to identify the carbon footprint, develop reduction plans, and then see how you can actually achieve targets. We are at the moment working on our target setting on asset class level. And to be fair,
I would like to come in over here, and especially the point that you mentioned about engaging with the portfolio companies. And I know that KKR, has a deep engagement process, for engaging the portfolio companies, and that also the climate management process. And I agree that unless there is a senior management, ownership and buy-in, it's challenging. But once you have the policy and governance in place, it's a question of implementation. So Elizabeth, let's talk about the process in terms of the climate integration, the risk management, and engaging with the portfolio companies, and how is KKR managing that?
Yeah, sure. And first I'll say that, I think a lot of the playbook, and this is good, a lot of the playbook that we use also sounds very similar to Partners Group in the sense that, we're aligning with the TCFD as well as we've developed and are implementing our strategy and thinking about which pieces are important. And like I said, that's good because I think this guidance is really important, and consistency is helpful in this case. I want to say it's sort of, we think about it in two buckets. I'm not going to go too much through the process because it sounds very similar to what you just heard. But, what this means, what does climate change mean to KKR? Two things. One is where we invest, and the other is how we invest. And where we invest, I think the report does a really good job of talking about what are the opportunities for climate solutions, that sort of thing. Very critical to KKR. Our $1.3 billion impact fund, one of the four main thematic areas is climate action. We have a energy transition team that joined KKR recently, but that's not unique to private equity, right? What's unique to private equity is how we invest and how we engage with the companies, as you mentioned. And so I think I'll highlight two ways that I think are really important. One is we worked with ERM actually about a year or so ago to create a climate risk assessment tool, sort of early diligence tool that helps us understand very early in the diligence process, is this low, medium, or high risk from both a transition and physical climate risk perspective? If yes, what's the additional diligence we need to do and engagement that we need to do with the companies over time to help them manage that? That's a very unique sort of capability of private equity, is to identify something in diligence, understand it, and then continue to work with the companies over time. Another idea, and I really love this idea, and I want to just also highlight that smaller GPs can also do this, is one thing that we started in 2020. This is just the beginning of this, is we developed a climate action webinar series for KKR portfolio companies. It is my deep personal belief that one reason we don't have more progress on climate change is a lack of understanding of what people should do. So this webinar series was all about what are the climate frameworks out there? How do you evaluate risk, manage it, and report it? What are scopes 1, 2, and 3, which actually more people don't know than do, I think. And 4, what are carbon offsets and when are they credible or not credible? And so I think by playing this role of educating our portfolio companies is something that we certainly focus on, and more GPs can do so as well.
That's an important point that you're making, Elizabeth, how GPs are changing their practices and how are they investing, and not just about, where are they investing. And from that perspective, Michael, the fact that, New York State Common has already established the net zero commitment, has your expectations from the GPs changed? Do you ask them questions? How are they investing? And what is your manager selection and monitoring process?
Sure. So we've actually had a focus and rigor in this area with GPs well before the commitment. We already had a climate category in our ESG risk assessments, which are included in our investment committee materials for every investment and tailored by asset class and strategy. So for private markets, we'll always begin the discussion with GPs at a high level around how they think about climate, physical and transition, risks and opportunities, and try to understand how they factor into 3 levels of how a manager is investing. The first is thematically at firm level or business unit level. So what are their views on those climate factors and how are they manifested across subsectors that they're investing in? The next level down is at fund or portfolio level. So from a portfolio construction perspective, how does the firm build those portfolios and where do climate considerations fit as companies or assets are added into new funds? How is risk reviewed on a continuous basis? We're also seeing a number of GPs dropping energy exposure in their flagship PE funds for reasons that are at most partly due to ESG considerations. We haven't invested in a dedicated traditional fossil fuel energy fund since 2015. So managers dropping traditional energy exposure from flagship PE funds is actually a huge positive driver for our own net zero goals. And then the third level we look at is at company level. We look to see what climate components are included in their diligence process, what climate KPIs are being tracked, how are the managers leveraging their influence or control to make progress on those KPIs over time. We've also built out ESG manager profiles across our entire GP base with climate components included, and they're calibrated based on where the manager and or specific business is in their maturity on this topic and what their outlook is for the future and what we want to be supporting and encouraging over time ultimately. We try to stay current via an annual refresh process on how GPs are continuing to integrate climate factors into their investment process from diligence through exit. And if a manager is a bit less mature and is only now getting a handle perhaps on their current emissions profile, perhaps looking to enhance their diligence process, we'll ask about and offer our perspective on different tools and processes we've seen work well at more mature GPs. And we might ask about ways after they get a handle on the current portfolio and add rigor to the DD process that they begin to perhaps consider that small universe of climate KPIs to track. Then in 12 to 24 months, we might ask questions around target setting. And then the most advanced place we can go is around, apart from the net zero and the target setting pieces, to then ask about potentially exploring a type of Paris or 2-degree aligned portfolio analysis exercise, or at least incorporating some of that discipline surrounding those kinds of exercises into their investment process. But we're really still only seeing that currently in a couple pockets in Europe. So the market has some ways to go globally to get to critical mass there.
Yeah, and I think it's interesting, and that's what we heard during our interview process as well, that LPs are just not demanding information and sophistication from GPs, but they are willing to work hand in hand with the managers, understand the process, support them through the journey, and which is a critical step. I think it's important for the industry to really align and understand the perspectives from both the LP's perspective and LPs understanding the GP's perspective and really working ultimately with the portfolio companies to help them decarbonize the strategy. I should remind our audience that, and I'm seeing that there are a number of questions already coming in. If you have any burning questions for our panelists, please feel free to put in your questions in the Q&A section. Till now, we have already covered in terms of challenges. There are challenges for the industry, but we are quickly overcoming those challenges. And we also spoke about some of the evolving practices. I would now like to pivot more towards what more can we do to really push the needle on climate, especially within the private equity sector. And Jaideep, I should bring you back into the conversation, considering your deep experience and ERM's 50 years of expertise of engaging clients. What are the emerging practices you are seeing with your clients, and where do you see the promise where we can push the needle on climate change?
Sure, Dazzle. And thanks for flagging our 50th birthday. We're really excited about it and hope to celebrate another 50 years in a more net zero kind of world. So look, first of all, we've heard some great examples from Elizabeth, Mátyás, and Michael about some of the great things that GPs and LPs are already doing. And all those things they mentioned will make a difference. But building on, I think two key things kind of really jump out at me in terms of the potential to have a real material impact. And first is what we heard, the decarbonization strategy. Private equity already have, they have invested, they've got hundreds of billions, and each of them, some bigger ones are hundreds of billions, some tens of billions of assets under management. And a lot of those investments are in more traditional businesses. I think the big prize and the big opportunity for everyone is how do we unlock the potential of private equity to help, particularly the more heavy emitting companies, the decarbonization strategy. And absolutely, it starts with having a great baseline, as Elizabeth talked about and Mátyás talked about, setting meaningful targets, and one of the and then helping them to actually do something about them as well. It's a great example we came across during the work. It was a private equity company, and they had invested in a conventional powertrain business, and how they provided capital to help the company really transform its business model and move towards an electric powertrain model. And by doing so, not only did they obviously retain their customer base, but brought new customer base because they were ahead of their competition, particularly in the electric sector. They also, at exit, needless to say, they were now part of the solution rather than part of the problem. The valuation, took a really positive turn as well. So I think there is a real opportunity to really look at the existing portfolio and see how the private equity capital can be deployed at pace and at scale to help them decarbonize. The second thing, again, we've touched on this, is the investment opportunity. And a lot of people talk about the ESG space, and in particular, the climate change. In fact, our 2020 private equity survey of investment professionals, we deliberately targeted investment professionals, indicated 93% of them believe that investing behind those mega trends, and I think Elizabeth called that, including sort of climate change in particular, would generate significant investment kind of opportunities and returns for them. And that kind of sentiment is also mirrored. I mean, if we look at just what Michael shared, within the LP community as well, the increasing inclination to invest behind those climate-friendly products and solutions. And I think the Collar Capital recent survey of 110 plus kind of LPs indicated at least 42% are really looking to step up their commitments there. So I think, so to kind of summarize, Dazzle, I would say, really help companies to decarbonize, and if necessary, provide the capital to help transform those businesses, the first. Second, double down on the investments in the climate change thematics, and superb opportunities in the very much PE space. And as I was saying, it's not just the infrastructure. There's digital, there's consumer goods, there's services companies. It's economy-wide impact, and there's a huge opportunity ahead of private equity. And what better way to kind of gain those opportunities by doing good and addressing a global challenge.
I have many more questions, but I also want to keep our audience engaged as well. And as I'm seeing the screen on my right, there are a number of questions popping in. We will try our best to address as many as possible, but there is a high possibility that we may not be able to do justice to all the great questions which are coming in. And if we are unable to cover those in the next 10, 15 minutes, we would turn back. If you leave your name and your email, we will try our best to respond to those questions. But before I have or come to the questions that I have, I would like to pick up a question that I see from the audience, especially on the investment hold period for private equity. One of the biggest challenges that the industry is facing in setting net zero commitments is the life cycle of the private equity investments, not knowing what the portfolio will consist in next 10 or 20 years from now. How do you really set a target today? I keep it open to the panel. Whoever wants to pick this up, please go ahead.
I'm happy to start and give my view on that. That's spot on. That's one of the bigger challenges that we face, because you then all of a sudden have an investment that has a higher carbon footprint and you're shying away from it, while actually you as an potential active owner in the future could really decarbonize it. So I think it's really looking at setting different buckets, and that you ensure that you can show over time how you decarbonize. I think it's wrong to only look at 2 or 3 years. As we know, this will take time, but that you consistently, with your main companies that have a significant carbon footprint, can show that you drive down emissions. It needs to be credible. But yeah, you're absolutely right. I think investors also need to appreciate that certain companies, of course, they will have a larger footprint, and and we should then take the responsibility and decarbonize them. I think that's the great opportunity that private equity has.
Can I add to that, Dazzle? I agree with that, but also I think it sort of goes back to a couple of my earlier points where I think our biggest impact can be in enabling, empowering these companies to do this themselves, right? So first with the carbon footprinting, as I mentioned, in 3 funds, we've committed that we want the companies themselves to generate an understanding of their carbon emissions. And 2, thinking about it at the portfolio company level, not the fund level, we want every company to develop a decarbonization plan, their own decarbonization plan that we will help them put in place and track over time. So I think, I just want to emphasize that that is a way that I think private equity has a unique role given the opportunities and challenges that we have.
Elizabeth, I don't know whether it's your answer to the question has prompted a question over here, or the question came a little earlier before you said that. But I think somewhere you did answer this question partially about how do you evaluate portfolio companies and support them with the carbon footprinting, but at the same time, how do you benchmark with other portfolio companies in the same sector? Do you have more thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, the question we got was really, sorry, the KKR energy saving lights keep going on and off over here. Yeah, I think the question was really focused on how do we do that at the diligence phase, at least that's how I read it, and how do we evaluate public carbon information. There usually isn't public carbon information. That's like a luxury in many cases. And in fact, I would say, like, just in general, I think finding appropriate benchmarks and public benchmarks is just really hard to do. So I think what we want to find as private equity investors, because it's not, we're not screening in or out companies necessarily based on this, but really understand what are the opportunities for this particular company based on its industry, its operations, and where it is today. And so that's where we really focus our attention versus publicly available benchmarks, which often aren't there for us.
Michael, there's a question for you in terms of how would you suggest or what would you recommend to GPs who are early in their stage to start with the process on the climate journey? And I believe there are many such recommendations that our report has put out specifically for GPs. Would you like to highlight any specific recommendations that our report mentions that GPs who are early in the game should really focus on?
Sure. So the report laid out 3 broad areas. And so of those 3, we would suggest they focus on the second category and investment management in particular in that category. So our ESG due diligence and monitoring program is highly focused on each manager's investment process and how they are diligencing investments, creating value during hold periods, and managing around the climate KPIs that our panelists have been discussing. The most important part of the governance aspect, so the first category, when we look at GP programs, are first the internal staffing. As to do this work well and at scale and have sustained focus, those resources do tend to be needed based on firm size, obviously. The actual day-to-day execution is what makes all of this real, as I said earlier, and that really does require having those resources that are perhaps less focused on the policy level work, the framework development, and the IR and marketing, and perhaps a bit more focused on providing that day-to-day support to investment teams, ops teams, and ultimately portfolio companies to do the work that was being described just a moment ago. So, they are then tracking progress against goals and metrics, rolling that into internal portfolio review committee processes, capturing the progress made against those KPIs, and finally packaging all of that up for exit. What a GP may or may not be doing at that exit phase is always a key dividing line for us in the work that we do. It helps us differentiate whether the KPI tracking is more of a strictly an LP disclosure exercise versus something that a GP believes actually creates value that they want to systematically highlight for potential buyers. It helps GPs tell a strong story for that company over the coming 5-year period so that it can be factored into a buyer's assessment of the value of that company. And all of that falls into category 2 listed in the report around investment management. And category 1 around the governance structure helps set the framework, provides the tone at the top, and provides the resources and repeatable processes to allow all of those category 2 items to happen. So for GPs earlier in their maturity, they're usually focused on enhancing their diligence process, training sector teams in a sector specific way, and perhaps beginning to undertake that footprinting piece. And they may or may not be tracking climate KPIs, or those KPIs may be more of a yes/no compliance driven type of KPI as opposed to actual emissions data and having climate action plans like what Elizabeth described. The more advanced GPs have had these types of process elements in place for at least a few years and have moved on to scoping out how incorporating some of the more advanced elements around target setting and leveraging temperature alignment measurement tools. So our view on this is those cutting edge practices can't just be taken on immediately. You have to crawl before you can walk in this context. So we focus on understanding each GP's process, where climate may be fitting into it, and then encouraging that evolution over time.
I'm glad that you manage the investment management process, and it's just not the process, it's also about value creation and impact. And over here, Mátyás, I would like to bring you in, since the report does highlight one of the recommendations is to increase investments in companies that are working to advance and scale climate solutions and technology. So can you share an example or two of the investments that Partners Group has made, which helps not only in making and creating value for the portfolio company, but also creates an impact in the real economy by reducing the emissions?
No, absolutely. And I think that brings me back to one of the elements of the TCFD, which is strategic asset allocation. And within that, we as Partners Group have identified decarbonization or low carbon or climate resilient investments as a mega trend for us. I mean, everyone in the industry is, of course, looking at many of these investments. And over the last years, we've invested into more than 20 renewable energy projects. And that, of course, has a real impact on the in the economy. I mean, just last year with that, we were able to avoid 1.5 million metric tons of CO2. Now, looking at other businesses that speak more to the scope 4 emissions, energy efficiency businesses, we've made an investment a couple of years ago into Techem, which is a leading European service provider for the metering business, and they develop smart meters. That, of course, also helps you to significantly reduce emissions. And just in 2020, they were able to avoid 8.7 million metric tons of CO2. And I think the last element I would just say here is we're more and more looking into carbon capture and sequestration plants. This is the next big thing. The IPCC, as we know, has identified this one of the main drivers for us to really reduce emissions then in the future. So that's another one I would really highlight we need to focus on in the future.
Elizabeth, a question for you. For investors in the world to meet net zero ambitions, private equity firms will have to really step up and take bold climate actions. In your opinion, what is needed in order to have more private equity firms come forward and set ambitious net zero commitments?
Yeah, I mean, first I'll propose that I believe that most GPs at this point aren't at the position of trying to decide whether they need to do something on this topic, but are really in the position of trying to figure out how to do something on this topic. And I think it's really critical that we seize this moment. And I think what's most important is collaboration. And I'm going to say this in two ways. First is collaboration between LPs and LPs, LPs and GPs, GPs and GPs, and GPs and PCs. And I know that was complicated, but I think what's really important is something that the report pointed out, which is that we're the big asset managers. There's a lot of firms out there that don't have the luxury of having teams like myself or others who can think about these issues every single day. We need to make sure that this isn't just a frenzy of activity at the top, but that all of the GPs are brought along in this journey. And I think that's so critical for us not to lose sight on this. This shouldn't be an area of competition. This really needs to be an area of collaboration, or the climate is not going to win. The second area of collaboration that I think is really important is actually within the climate change community itself. This is my day job. I spend all day thinking about ESG topics and climate change in particular. I'm on the board of SASB. I am very familiar with the term ABC soup, or is it acronym soup, or whatever the case is. In the climate change space, it's like acronym buffet or ABC buffet. Like it's just every single day we're hearing of a new set of goals or new set of commitments, new terminology. And I want to encourage the climate community to make sure that there is a consistent message that's coming to GPs, because I think it's really critical to solve for one of the points in the report, which is senior leadership understanding and buy-in. We need consistency of message. We also need to understand that GPs are at all different levels of this journey, and we need to make sure that we're celebrating big, bold commitments and making sure that people feel comfortable doing that. So it's for these couple of reasons that KKR is really thrilled to be part of Ceres Investor Network Private Equity Working Group, which is bringing together LPs and GPs to really focus on climate change and building a pathway for private equity investors. And it's my hope and vision that this will be a really safe place for both LPs and GPs to come together and start collaborating on this, because otherwise I think we will have a possibility of failure on this point, and we can't do that.
I like what you said, Elizabeth. To win on climate, it's not about competition; it's collaboration. And the complicated thing that you said, I think I've taken it well. And for the benefit of the audience, I'm going to repeat that: collaboration between LPs and LPs, LPs and GPs, GP and GP, and GPs and portfolio companies. And I think unless that collaboration happens, it's going to be challenging. And it's time that industry steps up, understands that this is not about competing with each other, but coming forward to collaborate and help with the industry alignment. And at the same time, I'm glad that you referred the Ceres Investor Network Private Equity Working Group. And that is the next step that we see coming from creating this report and creating the awareness in the industry, especially on climate for the private equity sector. How can we bring the industry together, the LPs and GPs together, to work on some of the thorny issues that we have discussed? And maybe I can request our colleagues to put up a slide out there which talks about what the Private Equity Working Group does. This particular working group is designed to specially help with the collaboration in the industry. We bring LPs and GPs together and help them transition their portfolios and set sustainable net zero economy. We would help we conduct monthly meetings where we support the GPs and LPs with climate-centric sustainable investment practices, policies, frameworks, and tools. So as many of you are working on this, you have already evolved with some of the practices. This is the place to come and share those practices. This is the place to be there and learn from your peers of what other peers are doing. This is the place to be there to really up your game on climate. We work together in addressing and managing and mitigating climate risk. We are also in a process of updating the net zero investment framework, a guidance document that would help both LPs and GPs in terms of setting a robust net zero targets. We would also help, and we understand that at this point in time, the industry is still not ready to make those commitments. But what is important is to have those credible climate action plans and processes in place. So this is the working group where we come together, where we talk about developing and implementing climate action plans. With this, I see that we are running closer to the top of the hour with 1 minute left, and we have a few more questions. We will try and address those over the email. But in conclusion, what we heard, and I should mention and reiterate that there is progress to be made. Though there is progress to be made, private equity has the potential, and it is uniquely positioned to transition and accelerate the pace of decarbonization. In spite of the challenges that the industry is facing, climate policies and practices adopted by many GPs and LPs are really shaping the course of direction for the sector to address the climate risk and opportunities. And finally, it is clear that for industry alignment and peer engagement, for a faster, transparent, and harmonized climate acceleration, industry will have to come together and work together moving forward. And with that, we are at the top of the hour. I really want to thank all our panelists for the insights and the practices that we have shared. And thank you to the audience for being part of with us today. Thank you.
Thank you.